5-year-old comforted crying native girl with toy. The next day, elders arrived with a gift. The air on John Miller's isolated homestead was thick with suspicion, weariness, and a fear as sharp as rusted wire. He stood on his porch, rifle cradled loosely, his gaze locked on his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, a splash of yellow calico near the creek. This wasn't fatherly affection. It was the rigid vigilance of a soldier on watch, a man who saw every shadow as a threat. The creek was his line in the sand, the border between his world and theirs. He'd seen what happened when those lines were crossed. The memory, sharp and bloody, of a dawn raid still echoed in his quiet moments. He'd helped put men in the bone orchard for far less. But Lily saw none of that. She saw only another child on the far bank, a native girl crying. And as Lily took her first step into the water, clutching her small wooden bird, John's world tilted. He was watching his daughter walk straight into enemy territory, armed only with a toy. And he knew that this single act of kindness could be bad medicine for them all. The sun was a hammer beating down on the tin roof of the world. John Miller felt its heat on the back of his neck, a familiar weight, no heavier than the rifle cradled in his arms. From the shade of the porch he watched. His gaze did not drift. It was anchored to a single spot of yellow calico moving near the creek's edge. His daughter, Lily, a 5-year-old sunbeam in a world of dust and shadow. This was his vigil. Every day. The air on their isolated homestead was a brew of suspicion and a weariness that settled deep in the bones. Fear was the only crop that grew without effort. It clung to the silence between the gusts of wind coiled in the deep shadows cast by the lone cottonwood. This land did not feel empty. It felt watched. His wife Sarah appeared at the doorway, her form a silhouette against the dim interior. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements sharp with a tension that never truly left her. "John, you'll burn a hole through her with that stare." He didn't turn, just watching. "She's chasing grasshoppers, not ghosts," Sarah said, her voice soft but strained. "Come inside. The heat is getting fierce. In a bit." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the buzz of cicadas and the unspoken things. The real things. The memory of the last family that tried to settle this close to the territories, and the whispers of what was found after. John's hand tightened on the warm wood of his rifle stock. He wasn't watching for ghosts. He was watching for the men who made them. And that's when he saw it. Across the creek, on the land that was not his, a second figure emerged from the shimmering heat haze. Small. Still. It was another child. A girl, her dark hair a stark line against the pale grass. She was sitting, her shoulders slumped, her face buried in her hands. John's breath caught. His soldier's mind catalogued the details. Alone, no weapon, no threat. But his settler's heart, a calloused and fearful thing, screamed danger. The creek was the line. The treaty was the line. And that child was on the wrong side of it. He saw Lily stop her chase. She stood perfectly still, her head cocked, a tiny bird listening for a song. She could not possibly hear the other girl's soft sobs over the gurgle of the water, but she could feel them. John knew she could. Lily felt the world in a way he no longer could, a way he had trained himself to forget. A flash of blue uniforms against red rock. The scent of black powder, hot and acrid. A woman's cry cut so brutally short, it was just a gasp on the wind. He blinked hard, the porch rail solid and real under his hand. It was just the sun on the water, just a trick of the heat. But the old fear was a coppery taste in his mouth. "Lily," he called out, his voice rougher than he intended. "You stay on this side of the water, you hear me, girl?" She turned her face a question. She pointed a small finger across the creek. "But Papa..." "She's crying." The simple words were a blow. He had no answer for them. How do you explain a generation of bloodshed to a heart that only understands a single tear? He watched frozen as Lily clutched the small hand-carved wooden bird in her fist, the one he had whittled for her during a long, cold winter. It was her treasure. She took a hesitant step toward the water. "Don't," his mind screamed. "Don't you dare cross that line." But Lily did not see a line. She saw a little girl who was sad. With the unthinking grace of childhood compassion, she waded into the shallow, sun-warmed creek. The water swirled around her dusty ankles as she walked away from his world, away from his fear, and into the vast, dangerous unknown of another's sorrow. John's knuckles were white on his rifle. Every instinct honed by years of survival and loss told him to run, to snatch her back, to shield her from the world he knew. But he was paralyzed, caught between the father who wanted to protect her innocence and the soldier who knew that innocence was the first thing to die out here. He watched her climb the opposite bank, a tiny ambassador armed only with a wooden bird approaching the crying child. The distance was too great to hear, but he saw the moment she knelt. He saw her hold out the toy, an offering, a truce, a gesture so pure and brave it made his own hardened heart ache with a pain he couldn't name. And as his little girl sat down in the grass, just inches from a child she was supposed to fear, John Miller felt the foundation of his world crack. The lines he had drawn in the dust, the walls he had built in his soul, began to tremble. He took a step off the porch, his boots hitting the dry, cracked earth. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands. He started to move, a slow walk that became a trot, then a dead run. He didn't know if he was running to stop a tragedy or to start one. His boots pounded the earth, each stride a jarring echo of his own frantic heartbeat. The rifle in his hands was a familiar weight, a third arm he had come to rely on more than his own, but now it felt clumsy, obscene. He was a storm of dust and fear, a man running to tear apart a moment he could not comprehend. He reached the edge of the creek, and his charge stuttered to a halt. The world went quiet. The scene before him was not one of danger. It was a painting rendered in soft light and impossible stillness. Two children, his Lily with her sun-gold hair, and the other girl, a raven-haired mirror, sat together in a patch of clover. The space between them was no wider than a breath. The air held no malice. The wooden bird, his clumsy carving, rested in the native girl's small hands, her fingers tracing its wings with a gentle, hypnotic curiosity. Lily was watching her, a small, trusting smile on her face. They were not speaking. They were sharing a language older than words, the language of a shared stillness, of a toy, given of a sadness understood. John's mind, a fortress built of discipline and trauma, reeled. Get her back. Get her back now. This is how it starts. A moment of quiet, then the flash of a knife. He could almost feel the phantom sting of it, the memory of a friend's gasp, the sudden shocking bloom of red on a blue uniform. He blinked, and the bloody memory dissolved back into the heat haze. It was just two little girls. Two little girls and a toy. The rifle felt heavier now, weighted with a sudden terrible shame. What kind of man was he to bring the specter of death to a scene like this? What kind of world had he built for his daughter, where an act of simple kindness was a prelude to violence? His finger eased off the trigger. The moment was broken by a shadow. A figure stepped from the line of trees behind the girls, as silent as the afternoon heat. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face a mask of impassive dignity carved from seasons of wind and sun. The girl's father. John's body went rigid, all the soldier in him snapping to attention. The rifle came up, the motion fluid, instinctive, a prayer to the only God he had left. The man saw him. He saw the rifle. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered from John's panicked face to the two girls, and for a heart-stopping second, the world held its breath. The air crackled, ready to ignite. But the man did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout a war cry. He simply raised one hand, palm open. a gesture of peace that was so profound, so utterly contrary to the violence racing in John's own body, that it felt like a physical blow. He took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving John's. He said a single word low and soft in a language John did not understand. The native girl looked up, her moment of peace shattered. She looked at the wooden bird in her hands, a flicker of regret in her dark eyes, and placed it carefully on the grass. She rose, took her father's outstretched hand, and gave Lily one last lingering look. Then they turned and walked away. They melted back into the trees, leaving the wooden bird sitting alone in the clover. John stood there, the rifle still half raised, his heart hammering against his ribs. The threat was gone. The confrontation he had run toward had vanished before it could begin. He was left alone with the sound of the creek, the buzzing of the insects, and the immense crushing weight of his own foolishness. He lowered the rifle, the click of the safety sounding like a gunshot in the sudden silence. He finally moved, crossing the creek that no longer felt like a border. He knelt in the grass beside his daughter. Lily looked up at him, her blue eyes swimming with a sad confusion. Her papa was sad too, she whispered. John had no words. He reached out and picked up the wooden bird. It was just a piece of whittled pine, but it felt like a judgment in his hand. "Come on, sunshine," he rasped, his voice thick. "Time to go home." He took her hand and they walked back toward the homestead, leaving the quiet patch of clover behind. But as they reached the porch, John glanced back over his shoulder. The trees across the creek were just trees, the shadows just shadows. But he could not shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Not with hatred, not with anger, with something else entirely. An ancient patient gravity he could not name. He told himself it was over. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had simply turned and walked away. But as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood and bruised purple, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the story was not finished. An offering had been made, a line had been crossed, and a response was coming. Night fell not as a comfort, but as a drawn curtain. The familiar sounds of the homestead became sinister whispers in the dark. The creak of the floorboards was a footstep on the porch. The hoot of a distant owl was a signal in the trees. John Miller sat at the rough-hewn table, the lamplight carving his face from the shadows, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. He cleaned his rifle for the third time since supper, his hands moving with a meticulous, practiced rhythm that did nothing to soothe the frantic energy coiling in his gut. Sarah watched him from across the room, her mending forgotten in her lap. "You'll wear the metal down to nothing, John." He didn't look up, just sighted down the clean barrel. A man's rifle is his life out here. And his family. She asked, her voice a fragile thread. "What are we?" "You're a ghost at your own table." Lily feels it. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes dark with a weariness that went deeper than labor. "I'm keeping her safe." Safe, from what Sarah's voice rose a mix of frustration and fear. From a little girl's father who did nothing but take his child home. He left the toy John. He walked away. "It's not that simple, Sarah," he said, his voice low and hard. "It is never that simple. They don't just walk away." He knew the pattern, the quiet probe, the test of defenses, the feigned retreat. He had seen it play out in a dozen dusty canyons, and it always ended in blood. He rose and walked to the window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. He was a sentry on the wall of his own fear, and the whole world was enemy territory. He stayed there long after Sarah and Lily went to bed, a lone figure keeping a bitter, silent vigil. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow, treacherous thing. A battlefield of broken images. The sudden high wail of a bugle, the roar of 100 rifles, the weight of a fallen comrade in his arms. He awoke with a gasp just before dawn, his heart a wild drum against his ribs, the sheets damp with a cold sweat. The morning arrived unnaturally still. The air was cool and pale, the light thin as if the sun itself was hesitant to rise. John was already on the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line where the man and his daughter had vanished. The world held its breath. And then he saw them. They came not with the thunder of a war party, but with the solemn gravity of a funeral procession. 4 figures emerging from the misty edges of the forest. They did not ride, they walked. Their progress was slow, deliberate, each step a testament to an ancient patience. In the lead was the man from yesterday, his face as impassive and stern as the mountains behind him. His companions were older, their faces maps of 1,000 seasons, their long hair braided with silver and feathers. They carried no rifles. They made no sound. They simply came. A cold dread, pure and absolute, seized John. This was it, the Council of Elders, the final judgment. "Sarah," he roared, his voice cracking. "Inside, get Lily to the cellar. Now!" He shoved them behind him, slammed the heavy oak door, and dropped the iron bar into its brace. The sound echoed with a terrible finality. He grabbed his second rifle, checking its load with trembling hands. He moved to the small window beside the door, poking the barrel through the opening. His world narrowed to the small circle of his gun sight. They stopped just beyond the edge of his cleared land. Just beyond easy rifle range. They stood there, 4 silent figures against the vast, empty landscape, their presence a suffocating weight. The silence stretched, screaming. John's breath was a ragged thing in his chest, his finger tight on the trigger. The lead elder's face was steady in his sights. One movement, one wrong move was all it would take. He could end this. Right now. Before it began. The leader, as if sensing the storm in John's soul, slowly raised his empty hand, the same gesture as the day before. He held it there for a long moment. Then, with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his age, he knelt. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and carefully placed a bundle on the ground. It was a soft deerskin parcel tied with gut. One by one, the other elders did the same, each placing a similar bundle before them. Gifts. Offerings. John stared, his mind unable to process the scene. This wasn't an attack. This wasn't a prelude to war. It was something else, something he had no name for, no memory of, no training for. His fear was a wild horse with nowhere to run. The lead elder rose to his feet. He took a single step forward, his dark eyes finding John's, peering through the small window and straight into his shattered soul. He did not smile. He did not threaten. He simply spoke. A single word in clear, broken English that traveled across the still morning air and struck John's heart like a bell. Daughter. The word hung there, a key to a door John never knew existed, a bridge across a chasm of fear he had spent his life digging. And he realized with a terror far greater than the fear of any battle that the next move wasn't theirs. It was his. Daughter. The word was not a sound. It was a physical thing, a stone dropped into the deep, silent well of John's soul. It rippled outwards, disrupting the ghosts. His finger, white-knuckled on the trigger, did not move. His eye remained pressed to the gun sight, the elder's weathered face a landscape of lines and shadows. The soldier in him screamed. It's a trick, a whisper to draw you out before the shout. Show a child offer a word, make you lower your guard. He had seen it before. A village of smiling women whose smiles hid knives. A peace offering that was a prelude to an ambush. The West was a graveyard of good men who had believed in the wrong moment of quiet. But the father in him was reeling. The word echoed with the sound of Lily's laughter. It held the image of her small hand reaching out across the creek, offering her most precious treasure without a moment's hesitation. It was a word that belonged to his world, to the warm lamplight of his cabin, to the smell of baking bread and the weight of a sleeping child in his arms. What was that word doing out there in the mouth of his fear? A hand touched his arm and he flinched, spinning away from the window, the rifle swinging around to face the new threat. It was Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own, but they held something else, too. A plea. "John," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the scene outside. "What is happening?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the words felt like a betrayal of every instinct that had kept him alive. A soldier always knew. He knew the enemy. He knew the threat. But looking at the four silent men standing in the morning light, he knew nothing. "They're not attacking," Sarah breathed, her hand still hovering near his arm. "They're just standing. Look at them, John. For once, don't look at the ghosts behind them. Just look at them." He turned back to the window, forcing himself to obey. He lowered the rifle an inch, looking not through the narrow killing circle of the gun sight, but with his own two eyes. He saw the wind gently stirring the feathers in their hair. He saw the deep, sorrowful lines etched around their eyes. He saw not a war party, but a delegation of grandfathers. Old men, steeped in a dignity he could not fathom, who had walked into the shadow of his gun for a reason he could not understand. His breath, which had been a shallow, panicked thing, slowly deepened. The wild pounding in his chest began to subside. He looked at the rifle in his hands. It was a tool for ending things, for making noise, for creating widows and orphans. It had no place in this deafening, sacred silence. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the rifle back from the window. He leaned it against the wall. The soft thud of the wooden stock against the cabin logs was the loudest sound he had ever heard. "John, what are you doing?" Sarah gasped. He didn't answer. He turned to the door and reached for the iron bar. It was heavy cold, a solid line of defense he had bolted in place against the world. His hand, slick with sweat, struggled for a grip. With a groan of protesting metal, he lifted it from its brace. He pulled the door open. The pale morning light flooded the dark cabin, making him blink. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands empty, his heart a raw, exposed nerve. He felt naked. He felt more vulnerable than he had in any battle. He stood there, a lone man on his porch. The four elders stood in the field. The space between them was 100 years of war and mistrust. No one moved. The lad elder, the grandfather, met his gaze. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. He raised his hand and gestured to the bundles on the ground. Then he touched his own heart. And then he pointed not at John, but at the cabin door, where Lily was now peeking out from behind her mother's skirts. The meaning was as clear as the morning air. "Our heart. To your daughter." John's throat was thick with a feeling he couldn't swallow. It was shame, hot and bitter. It was awe. It was a grief for a part of himself that had been lost for so long. The grandfather gestured to the small girl beside him who had been hiding behind his legs. Timidly, she stepped forward. In her hands, she held the small wooden bird. But it was changed. Tied carefully around its neck with a strand of dark sinew was a single, brilliant blue feather, the blue of a mountain bluebird, the color of the sky after a storm. And next to it a tiny, intricately stitched bead of turquoise. They had not just brought it back. They had honored it. They had added their own story to it. They had made it sacred. The last wall inside John Miller crumbled into dust. He understood in a wave of crushing, heartbreaking clarity that he had been aiming his rifle not at an enemy but at a grieving grandfather. He had been ready to spill blood over a peace offering. He had let the ghosts of his past nearly murder his future. He couldn't speak. He could only stand there, a broken man on his own porch, and give a slow, deep, painful nod. A nod of understanding. A nod of respect. A nod that was an apology for a lifetime of fear. The elders seemed to understand. Their purpose fulfilled, they gave a last solemn look, turned as one, and began their long, silent walk back to the trees from which they came. They left the gifts lying on the grass, a bridge of peace in a land that had only ever understood war. But as John watched them go, he looked past his own land toward the distant smoke rising from the chimneys of the town. He saw the small watching figures of his neighbors on their own porches, men who shared his fears but not his revelation. And he knew that accepting this peace might have just declared a different, more complicated kind of war. The silence the elders left behind was heavier than the one they had broken. It was a silence filled with meaning, with a story that had no words. John stood on the porch watching the space where they had vanished, the brilliant blue feather on the wooden bird in his hand, a tiny, impossible jewel. Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. She did not ask what had happened. She had seen it in his eyes, the storm of fear giving way to a strange, broken calm. He finally moved, his steps slow, hesitant. He walked off his porch past the invisible line of his own fear and into the field. He knelt before the gifts. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the first bundle. It was a buffalo robe, thick and heavy, tanned to the softness of worn velvet and smelling of wood smoke and sage. It was a gift of warmth against a hard winter. Another held strips of dried jerky meticulously wrapped in leaves, a gift of sustenance. The last held a mix of dried herbs, their wild medicinal scent a promise of healing. They were gifts of life, an answer to his daughter's simple gift of a wooden bird. He looked up and saw Lily holding her mother's hand, her eyes wide with a wonder that held no trace of fear. She saw only the beautiful things on the grass. A profound and terrible sadness washed over him. He had spent years teaching her the grammar of fear, which shadows to avoid, which silences to mistrust. And in one afternoon, with a single act of courage, she had taught him the language of grace. He had been the student all along. The quiet moment shattered. The sound of hoofbeats, fast and angry, tore through the morning stillness. A group of riders crested the small rise that led from the town. It wasn't a delegation. It was a posse. John rose slowly to his feet, instinctively moving to stand between the riders and his family. 4 men. Croft, the blustering town elder who owned the mercantile, was in the lead. His face was a thundercloud of righteous fury. Miller Croft shouted, reining his horse in so sharply it skittered and whinnied. He pointed a thick finger at the bundles on the ground. "What is this? What devil's bargain did you make? We saw them from the ridge. They came in peace." Croft. John said, his voice quiet, steady. "Peace." Another man spat his hand, resting on the butt of his pistol. "An Indian's peace is the moment he's reloading. You're a fool, Miller, or a traitor." "What did you promise them?" "I promised them nothing." He held up the wooden bird with its new blue feather. "My daughter gave their girl a toy. They returned the kindness." Croft let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Kindness. They're savages, that's payment, Miller. Payment for what water rights safe passage when they decide to raid us. What secrets did you sell for a few raggedy furs?" The accusations hung in the air, ugly and dense as smoke. They could not see the gesture. They could only see the transaction. Their fear had blinded them to the possibility of anything else. John looked at their faces, hard frightened and so certain of their own hatred. He had worn that same face just an hour ago. He saw a warped reflection of himself, and the shame of it gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. It was about a little girl who was crying. John said, his voice ringing with a clarity that silenced them for a heartbeat. It was about a moment of kindness. It's a thing you men have clearly forgotten. Croft's face darkened. His pride stung. "We have buried our sons and brothers to hold this land, to make it safe from them. We did what we had to. And you invite them to your doorstep for a powwow." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "This town doesn't have room for divided loyalties, Miller. You're either with us or you're with them." He straightened up, his authority absolute. "You have until sundown tomorrow. "You gather up this trash," he sneered, gesturing at the sacred gifts, "and you burn it. Right here, where we can all see it. You make a pillar of smoke that tells them their witchcraft isn't welcome here. You show us where you stand." His gaze was as cold and hard as a winter grave. "Or you pack your wagon and you get out. If you're still on this land come sundown and those things are still here, we'll come back, and we'll burn it all for you." Without waiting for a reply, Croft wheeled his horse around and the posse galloped away, leaving a cloud of accusatory dust to settle over the homestead. John stood alone in the field, his family behind him, the peace offerings at his feet. He looked at the buffalo robe, a gift of warmth, and then at the hard, unforgiving faces of the town he once called home. He had survived a war against strangers. He had made a fragile peace with an old enemy. Now he had to face a new war with his own neighbors. And he had to decide once and for all which peace was worth fighting for. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in the searing colors of a fresh wound. It was almost time. John stood on the porch, the air cool and still. He did not hold his rifle. His hands were empty at his sides. He watched the long shadows of the cottonwoods stretch like searching fingers across the land, reaching from the town toward his home. The ultimatum had hung in the air all day, a promise of smoke and ash. But the gifts remained where the elders had left them, a quiet testament on the grass. Sarah came and stood beside him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She did not need to ask. His decision was in the stillness of his posture and the clear, steady set of his jaw. "They will come soon," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let them come," he answered. She looked at the buffalo robe, its deep, rich fur absorbing the last of the day's light. "I've never felt anything so warm." "We're not burning it," Sarah John said, his voice firm, a vow spoken to the coming night. "I know," she replied, and her hand found his. In her touch he felt not fear, but a shared, unbreakable resolve. A home. He let go of her hand and walked into the field. He bent and lifted the heavy buffalo robe. It smelled of sage and open country, of a world older than towns and fences. He carried it not like plunder, but like a sleeping child. He walked back into the cabin, into the small room where Lily slept, her breathing deep and even. The lamplight cast a golden glow on her face, a portrait of perfect, untroubled peace. He gently unfolded the robe and draped it over the foot of her small bed. A gift of warmth. A shield of peace. He was bringing the outside world into his home, not as a threat, but as a blessing, an acceptance. He walked back to the porch and stood beside his wife, waiting. Soon they saw the dust, a rising plume against the violet sky. The riders. They came as they had before, a knot of hard-faced men, but their charge faltered as they drew closer. They saw the field empty. They saw the cabin, its windows glowing with a soft, defiant light. They saw John and Sarah standing together on the porch, unarmed, their faces turned toward them, waiting. Croft pulled his horse to a stop, his posse fanning out behind him. His face was a mask of confusion and rage. He had come expecting a fire, or a fight, or a packed wagon. He had not come expecting this. This quiet dignity, this refusal to participate in his fear. "Miller," he bellowed, his voice tight with frustration. "The sun is down. Where is the fire?" John did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply looked at the man who had demanded a sacrifice to the god of hatred. "There is no fire here," Croft John said, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "Only warmth." Croft stared, his mind scrambling for purchase on a reality that had slipped from his grasp. He could not attack an unarmed man standing beside his wife. He could not burn a home that stood in quiet defiance. To do so would be to become the very monster he preached against. He was defeated not by a gun, but by a choice he could not comprehend. With a curse that was choked by his own impotence, Croft wrenched his horse's reins, turned, and galloped back into the darkness, his men following like scattered leaves in his wake. The sound of their hoofbeats faded, leaving only the sound of the crickets and the vast breathing silence of the plains. The war was over. The world outside their small cabin remained a hard, unforgiving place. But inside, for the first time, there was a peace built not on fences and fear, but on a bridge. A peace bought not with gunpowder, but with a child's toy. A peace protected not by a rifle, but by a simple, terrifying choice to be better. John had chosen his daughter's world over the one he had known. And in doing so, he had finally truly come home.